And I think that what ought to be recognized is that African countries are going through a very difficult situation. And whenever you see IMF and World Bank coming into your country, you should be very worried as an ordinary African, because they are not interested in the welfare of...
There are speeches you listen to with your ears, and then there are speeches that punch you in the chest and force you to confront the truth. PLO Lumumba's words fall into the second category, the category of speeches that do not entertain, but awaken. When he spoke, he didn't give Africa comforting illusions or diplomatic sugarcoating. He held up a mirror that many leaders avoid, many citizens fear, and many nations pretend not to see. But hidden within that mirror were revelations, uncomfortable ones, necessary ones, and deeply misunderstood ones. This breakdown is not just a summary of his speech, it is an unraveling of what he truly meant. Because Lumumba never speaks in mere sentences. He speaks in warnings, in metaphors, in coded truths that expose both Africa's wounds and its possibilities. So, let us walk through his message, slowly, layer by layer, and ask, what was he really telling Africa? Let's find out. When Lumumba began his speech, he didn't ease the audience into comfort or warm-up rhetoric. He walked straight into the wound. He described Africa not through charts or government reports, but through lived experience. The experience Africans see every morning, but have been conditioned to normalize. He spoke of leaders whose lives float far above the daily struggles of their own people, insulated by wealth, privilege, and foreign connections. And this wasn't an exaggeration, it was an X-ray of the continent's political soul. Lumumba painted the contrast with surgical precision. Leaders whose children attend the best schools in Europe while ordinary citizens' children sit on cracked wooden benches. Leaders whose families receive medical treatment abroad while the public queuing at local hospitals are sent home with nothing but a prescription and a prayer. Leaders protected by motorcades while citizens stand powerless in the rain waiting for public transport. The distance between the ruler and the ruled is no longer symbolic. It is physical, emotional, and moral.
We are talking about, as I speak to you now, the public university have been on strike for almost a month. That is a national crisis and emergency. Have you heard our parliament meet that there is a national crisis? No, instead we are talking about elections which are 1.5 years away, and our young men and women are not going to school, which means those who had acquired scholarships are losing them. Nobody cares. Recently at one of the universities here, a medical student who had gone into a 5-year course graduated after 9 years. When you now go for your postgraduate, they're asking you, how did a 5-year course take 9 years and you have an upper, second, and first class? What was happening? You are repeating every year. Nobody cares. Because your political class take their children to Europe and America and Australia and Malaysia and South Africa, they don't care.
But Lumumba's criticism was not simply leaders are bad. It had a deeper meaning. He was exposing the psychological separation between African leadership and African reality. He was pointing to a truth people rarely say openly. Many leaders do not feel urgency because they do not feel the consequences. And when a leader does not feel consequences, accountability dies. Once accountability dies, progress slows. Once progress slows, stagnation becomes normal. And once stagnation becomes normal, suffering becomes permanent. That was the heart of his message. Africa is not failing because it is poor. Africa is failing because its leadership lives outside the conditions it governs. When he spoke about leaders' families living in comfort, it wasn't envy nor anger, it was analysis. A leader who never sees darkness cannot understand the urgency of electricity. A leader who never stands in a hospital queue cannot understand the urgency of healthcare reform. A leader whose children will never enter a public classroom cannot understand the urgency of educational transformation. This is why Lumumba's words hit differently, because he wasn't accusing individual people. He was diagnosing a system A system where the ones making decisions are not the ones suffering their consequences. And when decision makers do not feel pain, they do not rush solutions. They do not prioritize citizens. They do not innovate. They do not wake up at night worrying. Why? Because their personal world operates smoothly, untouched by the chaos around them. He wanted the audience to understand that Africa's problem is not ability, not resources, not intelligence, but disconnect. The people who must fix the continent are the people least affected by its problems. But after painting this harsh picture, Lumumba intentionally paused, because this opening segment leads to a bigger question Africa must confront. If leadership is this disconnected and comfort has created blindness, does that mean nothing good is happening in Africa at all? To understand Lumumba's brilliance, you have to notice how he shifts gears after exposing the painful disconnect between African leaders and African realities. He does something unexpected. Instead of drowning the audience in despair, he introduces a counterweight, small, modest signs of progress scattered across the continent. It is his way of saying, yes, things are bad, but do not lie to yourself and say nothing is working. He pointed to these small victories deliberately. The young engineers building innovations in modest workshops, the local farmers experimenting with better methods, the universities producing pockets of excellence, the factories struggling but still running in a global economy that tries to suffocate them. He acknowledged the rise of entrepreneurs, the growing hunger for education among youth, and the quiet determination shaping communities in places where government fails. But he didn't romanticize these pockets of progress. He didn't allow the audience to get comfortable with them. He treated them realistically, like sparks in the dark, not rays of dawn. His subtle message, don't mistake activity for transformation. And this is where his commentary becomes layered. Lumumba knew that if he only criticized, people would say he was too negative. If he only praised, people would say he was unrealistic. So he walked straight down the middle, acknowledging hope but dissecting it, exposing its limits, and reminding the audience that a few shining examples cannot light an entire continent. He explained that these small successes are often isolated, geographically, economically, and politically. A breakthrough in Nairobi doesn't automatically uplift a village in Niger. A successful innovation in Kigali doesn't transform public schools in Freetown. The continent is filled with brilliant individuals but weak structures. And brilliance without structure becomes another wasted opportunity, another story of what could have been.
But that is not to say that there are no good things happening in the continent of Africa. There are. There are good things happening in Mauritius. There are good things happening in Little Seychelles. There are good things happening in Namibia. There are good things happening in Botswana. There are good things happening in Rwanda, but they are too small to have the...
Lumumba's deeper meaning was this. Africa is not dead. Africa is not stagnant. Africa is not hopeless. But the progress happening today is too slow, too local, too fragile to shift the entire trajectory of a continent with 1.4 billion people. It is like drops of water falling on a continent-sized fire. He wanted Africans to recognize both sides of reality. Hope exists, yes, but hope alone does not build roads. Hope alone does not reform institutions. Hope alone does not resist exploitation. And here lies the hidden lesson. If Africans cling too tightly to small signs of progress, they will treat symptoms instead of curing the disease. They will celebrate minor victories while ignoring systemic failure. Lumumba was warning the audience not to let isolated success become a smokescreen that hides continental stagnation. Because Africa doesn't need isolated breakthroughs, it needs coordinated progress. It doesn't need pockets of excellence, it needs structural excellence. It doesn't need a few countries shining, it needs the entire continent rising together. And that leads directly into the next big question he forced the audience to confront. If progress exists but remains too small to transform Africa, then what is the missing force that could multiply these sparks into a continental wildfire? Individually, African nations are simply too small to matter globally, not morally, not culturally, but strategically. A population of 20 million here, 40 million there, 5 million somewhere else, each speaking differently, trading differently, negotiating differently. In a world where power comes from scale, no African state has enough weight on its own to influence global decisions. And this is exactly what Lumumba wanted people to confront. It's not that Africans lack talent or resources or courage. It's that these strengths are trapped inside 54 separate boxes. He pushed the point further by showing how this fragmentation benefits everyone except Africa. A divided Africa is easy to pressure, easy to intimidate, and easy to manipulate. Countries negotiate alone, borrow alone, sign contracts alone, and get exploited alone. A foreign nation doesn't need to overpower the entire continent. It just picks one isolated state, offers it incentives, and uses it to weaken the collective. Fragmentation becomes the quiet weapon that keeps Africa predictable. But Lumumba wasn't only diagnosing a problem. He was hinting at Africa's greatest untapped superpower. He argued that if the very same nations that struggle individually were to coordinate their economies, align their policies, and negotiate as one voice, the entire balance of global power would shift. Africa would no longer be 54 negotiators standing in line. It would be one giant bargaining block that nobody can ignore. What he meant beneath the words was powerful. Africa is not weak. Africa is disorganized.
To have an impact that we desire. If you go to Burkina Faso, the Burkina Faso economy is a small one. It's not more than 25 billion United States of America. So the actions of taking out some of the French influence is commendable. But is it coordinated? Can it resist France and the European Union? Can it resist the pushback by these neo-colonialists? No, it can't. The only way that we can do so is to work in a coordinated fashion.
Strength exists, but it is distributed, scattered, and uncombined. Potential exists, but it is bottled up inside borders drawn by people who never intended for Africa to rise. And this is the part that many people miss. Lumumba wasn't appealing to emotion. He wasn't making unity sound romantic or sentimental. He was making a strategic argument. The kind of argument corporations use when they merge, or nations use when they form alliances. He was saying, you cannot win if you are too small to be taken seriously. And if you are small alone, you must become big together. In other words, unity isn't charity. It's self-preservation. Unity isn't idealism, it's mathematics. Unity isn't a dream, it's a geopolitical strategy. And this set up the next turning point in his message. Because once you accept that unity is the multiplier Africa needs, one question immediately arises. If unity is the key to Africa's strength, then when should the continent begin acting on it, later or right now? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. He explained that the world is shifting faster than at any point in modern history. New alliances are forming. Global powers are competing ruthlessly for resources. Technology is rewriting industries overnight. Markets are realigning, and geopolitical influence is moving like a storm. In such a world, a continent that moves slowly is not just left behind, it becomes vulnerable, dependent, and eventually irrelevant in shaping major global decisions. Lumumba's deeper meaning was clear. Africa is standing in front of a door that will not stay open indefinitely. History does not wait. Opportunities do not pause. Power does not freeze in place. He wanted Africans to understand that later is the most dangerous word in the continent's political vocabulary. Later becomes next year. Next year becomes the next decade. The next decade becomes it's too late. For 60 years, African nations have postponed continental unity, postponed industrialization, postponed reform, postponed regional integration, always waiting for more stability, more resources, more political will. Meanwhile, other continents marched forward. But Lumumba didn't simply blame leaders. He challenged citizens too. He made the audience realize that every generation that postpones action pushes the burden onto the next. And there is a point when future generations can no longer correct the mistakes inherited from the past. This is why his tone changed in this segment. It became urgent, almost impatient. He wanted people to hear the ticking clock behind every sentence. He was telling Africans, if you miss this window, the world will reorganize without you. He used history itself as an example. Nations that acted early, China, South Korea, Singapore, and the UAE, rewrote their destinies within a generation. Those who delayed are still fighting the same battles decades later. Africa cannot afford to continue in delay mode, not when the global race has already begun. Lumumba also understood something psychological. Urgency wakes people up. People act not because they are inspired, but because they are pressured by time. By saying the time is now, he wasn't making a motivational statement. He was setting a deadline.
My call to you is that the time is now. The time is now to give meaning to the promises that you've made yourself. The time is now to improve your agriculture. The time is now to improve your engineering. The time is now to improve your technology. The time is now to recognize that what we call luck is an intercourse between preparedness and hard work. The time is now for us to work smart. The time is now to harness our potential.
And that deadline raises the next unavoidable question. If Africa must act immediately, then what is the very first step the continent must take to break its cycle of dependency and stagnation? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. For decades, African nations have looked outward for partners, saviors, lenders, and protectors. They waited for foreign governments to invest in their industries, for international organizations to solve their crises, for global powers to give them opportunities. And each time, Africa received the same pattern: short-term help with long-term strings, assistance that produced dependence, partnerships that favored the stronger side, deals that kept Africa in a subordinate position. Lumumba wanted Africans to understand that expecting outsiders to build Africa is the slowest route to failure. That is why he emphasized cooperation within the continent. Because when Mali faces instability, Senegal cannot pretend it is isolated. When Sudan burns, Ethiopia and South Sudan feel the heat. When Nigeria innovates, the region benefits. And when Botswana prospers, Southern Africa gains strength. The continent is interconnected, whether it acknowledges it or not. Lumumba's deeper point was this: Africa's weakness is continental. Therefore, its solution must be continental. No single country, not even the strongest, can build a prosperous future while surrounded by nations drowning in crisis. Prosperity cannot exist in pockets. It requires regional stability, shared growth, and coordinated planning. He wanted Africans to rethink the meaning of solidarity, not charity, not sympathy, but strategic collaboration, the kind that Europe uses, the kind ASEAN uses, the kind the Gulf states use. Africa must trade more with Africa, invest more in Africa, protect African markets, defend African sovereignty collectively, pool resources, pool intelligence, pool research, pool manufacturing. That is how continents rise. And he was blunt about the alternative. If African nations remain isolated, foreign powers will continue playing them against each other, picking one country at a time, offering attractive deals that weaken regional unity, and exploiting internal divisions for their own strategic gain. Thus, the continent becomes not a player in global geopolitics, but a marketplace for other nations' ambitions. Lumumba's message was simple but revolutionary. Africa does not need external permission to rise. Africa does not need external gifts. Africa needs Africans who understand that their neighbors' success strengthens them, and their neighbors' collapse weakens them. He wanted Africans to expand their identity, not just I am Kenyan, I am Nigerian, I am Burkinabe, but I am African. Because the world treats Africa as one block when it extracts, but Africa behaves like 54 separate pieces when it negotiates. His final meaning in this message was clear. The continent will never break its chains unless it stops dragging them in different directions.
African countries must be bold enough.
Or we are being hypocritical.
We must not be hypocritical. We must be bold enough to tell our colleagues, if you love your neighbor and you love the thing that they are doing, when their house is on fire, you tell them your house is on fire. And you help them to put the fire down. You don't pretend that there is no fire.
And that brings us to the final decisive question his speech forces the continent to answer. If Africa must rely on Africans, then what does Africa's future now demand from every citizen and every leader? Lumumba makes it unmistakably clear that the destiny of this continent is no longer in the hands of colonial forces, foreign powers, or external institutions. Those days are gone. The world has changed. The geopolitical map has shifted. Nations act based on interest, not friendship. Assistance comes with conditions, not generosity. And influence is negotiated, not gifted. Whether Africa rises or falls now depends not on external forces, but on the internal will, discipline, courage, and unity of Africans themselves. He wants Africans to understand something uncomfortable, but liberating. No savior is coming. No foreign power will build Africa's prosperity before building its own. No international institution will prioritize African dignity above its strategic goals. No outside country will fight harder for African futures than Africans. This is not pessimism, it is empowerment. Because if the responsibility is internal, then so is the power. Africa does not need permission to industrialize. It does not need supervision to reform its systems. It does not need external validation to become great. The continent is already rich in resources, rich in youth, rich in culture, and rich in untapped potential. What it needs is belief backed by action. Lumumba is urging Africans to shift their mindset from survival to ownership, from complaint to construction, from passive hope to active agency. He is telling citizens that voting is not enough, demanding accountability is not enough, criticizing leadership is not enough. The continent needs individuals who see themselves as participants in history, not observers of tragedy, people who treat Africa's problems as personal missions, not distant headlines. He is also speaking directly to leaders, both current and future. He wants them to understand that leadership is not a privilege but a burden, not a throne but a responsibility, not a pathway to comfort, but a contract with suffering. If African leaders do not embody urgency, integrity, and sacrifice, the continent will remain stuck in cycles of disappointment. And beneath all of this, he delivers one more hidden message. Africa's story has not yet been written. It is not doomed. It is not destined to fail. Its future is open, unfinished, waiting to be shaped by the hands of those who refuse to accept mediocrity. The speech ends not with fear, not with despair, but with a challenge, a simple question that echoes louder than all the others. If Africa's future now depends entirely on Africans, then who among us is ready to rise and begin the work? Let us know in the comments section. Are you ready? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about, the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.